Good afternoon, fellow peace workers. On behalf of Ecumenical Peace Institute, clergy and laity concerned, I would like to welcome you to our annual EPI Fall Gathering. My name is Daniel Zwickel Ben Avram, and I am co-president of the Board of Directors. And thank you, St. John's, for graciously hosting us. We deeply appreciate it. EPI began during the war against Vietnam with counter-recruitment actions by clergy and lay people at the Oakland Armed Forces Induction Center. We have remained explicitly multiracial, interfaith, and activist, and have maintained a focus on the interrelated issues of racism, militarism, and materialism, providing a context for education, reflection, and nonviolent action. We make a particular effort to make clear the connection between the issues and work in coalition with issue-specific organizations. We seek to answer the call to change systems which create and perpetuate misery for most of the world's people, joining to build a community of justice locally and worldwide. And we welcome once again our featured speaker, Norman Solomon, who will speak on his new book, War Made Invisible: How America Hides from the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. The first 14 people, by the way, to donate $50 or more will receive a complimentary hardback copy. Once again, we bid you welcome and wish you a fruitful evening. Now with a report from Western Sahara. Please welcome, via video, Salka Libre.
Hi, is Salka here?
I don't think so. Go ahead.
Okay, so okay. Hi, my name's Wind Kaufman, and I'll make apologies for Salka. I'm not sure what's going on. I just got a message from her a few minutes ago that she doesn't feel well, but I don't know. I wasn't sure if that meant she wasn't coming or not. But anyway, I've been working closely with Salka and other immigrants from Western Sahara in the United States on educating and trying to liberate Western Sahara. And it was the subject of last year's program. And I know there's a recording, and I encourage everyone to watch that recording if you haven't already. The situation really hasn't changed that much. I'm sorry Salka can't be here personally to update you with more detail, but it basically hasn't changed much. Western Sahara remains the last colony in Africa. It remains under a brutal occupation by Morocco, and it has many similarities to what's going on in Palestine. Of course, the genocide that's going on in Gaza, which is just unbelievably accelerated in scope and timeline from what's been happening in the last 70 years, is not happening yet in Western Sahara, but Morocco is using Israel's playbook. It uses a lot of the tactics, and of course it has a partnership with Israel now. The team that I was on that got a cohort into Western Sahara in 2022 to break the siege of the Kaya sisters' house, which had been surrounded. And Sultana Kaya is a well-known activist. That cohort is getting reactivated, and we are going to start promoting travel. To Western Sahara. Sorry about that. And so I want you to keep an eye out for an announcement about that exciting new project. It's called Just Visit Western Sahara. It's going to be about tourism and political tourism and ecological tourism and appropriate tourism. And Western Sahara is really a beautiful land. Maybe some of you don't know it, but it's like a destination for stargazers. All right. I think that's enough. If anybody has questions, I suppose I can take them now or at the end whenever is appropriate.
Cynthia Simmons.
The donation now?
Whatever's next.
Okay.
Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome.
EPI is a 501c nonprofit religious organization, prophetic voice and witness, embracing all faith and earth-based traditions, serving a vital role in the Bay Area peace and justice community and around the world, with a focus on the genocide against the Palestinian people, which our government supports and funds, the plight of the Haitian people, and on ground zero in our national nuclear weapons program, the Lawrence National Weapons Lab in Livermore. But we do not live on peace and love alone. Compassion cannot by itself keep the lights on. Please support us as generously as you are able in this continual horror we face. Another 4 years of hatred in the Oval Office. We wonder what we can do as individuals. Well, we must all work that out for ourselves. But there is one thing that we can do: support organizations like EPI that fight the good fight. And we cannot exist without your support. Though just a few dollars even might not seem like much, it does add up, and it's indeed individuals like you that make our work possible. Those of you who are not here can go to our website and donate safely and securely, epicalc.org. That's epicalc.org. Peace and blessings. May we live long and prosper, and help us to prosper as well. Peace. Namaste.
So, introduce it.
We're going to play an excerpt from the film The Night Won't End, and there is a link to that video on our website, which you may visit at another time to watch in full, but we will be playing selected excerpts to give you a taste of the horror that is going on. So here it is from the film The Night Won't End.
البحر لما أقعد بالبحر وبطلع فيه خلص بحس إنه همومنا وجعنا كلها راحة. البحر كان هو الوجهة اللي برتاح فيها لما أقعد وأشوفها. إحنا حالياً رغم إصابتنا والوجع اللي إحنا فيه إنه نضل على قيد الحياة. يعني ممكن شوية النهار يهون علينا لو صار القصف إنه في ضوء وفي نهار في شمس. بيجي الليل طبعاً بالقلق وبالخوف وبالرعب لأنه الليل بيعني لنا الخوف. مرات شفط البيوت بتروح بتنزل، مرات قصف بالاف 16. فدائما انا واولادي عن نفسي اطفالي عايشين بالرعب وبالخوف. دائما يا ماما اشي بده يصير فينا، كيف بدنا نضلنا طيبين.
Hiba Salem and her family have been trying to survive Israel's war in Gaza for months. After Hamas's attack on October 7th, when nearly 1,200 people were killed and more than 200 were taken captive, the Israeli government launched an unrelenting war. The destruction and civilian death toll in so short a time has been like nothing the world has seen in decades.
the number of victims, the collective punishment, the denial of humanitarian assistance very early on, those violations of humanitarian law, the violations of the right to life, all the instruments that we've established in 1948 so far have proven to be, frankly, useless. We are really as close to the abyss as we have ever been.
ويعني والله ما بنام طول الليل بضلنا افكر فيهم بطلع على الصور بضلنا اعيط عليهم بنات صغار عمرهم يعني 6 سنين وبنت عمرها 8 سنين من دون ام ايه يعني ايه بكره ايش هالبنت من دون ام ايه يعني كل ما تقول له ماما وين ماما.
And despite the massive loss of life and numerous allegations from human rights groups of violations of international law, the United States, Israel's main ally, never wavered in its support.
I think the US has actual knowledge that war crimes are being committed. Of course we do. They are in the newspapers and on the television every day. And we certainly have other means of knowing what is happening in Gaza. And yet we continue to provide the arms that enable these. So inherently we are complicit.
Among Gaza's more than 2 million people, no family has been spared the impact of this war. To understand that struggle, we worked with journalists in Gaza to hear the stories of 3 families about their devastating losses and what it's been like trying to survive.
يعني بالذات الليل لما يجي برضاش يخلص. يعني حتى تصحى في الليل طول الليل بتكون صاحي بتقول بدهش يطلع الصبح بدهش يطلع الصبح. إياد لما بصحى بالليل بحط راسه تحت راسي بخبي وجهه عن الليل بقول لي خلصش الليل بدهش يخلص الليل. مش راضي يخلص الليل. الليل طويل، الليل مرعب، الليل يعني خوف، الليل يعني انك تذكر هند.
عمريش تخيلت أو توقعت كل الأحداث اللي صارت معنا من أول الحرب لحتى الآن.
One of the first losses Hiba and her family experienced in the war was their home. She and her husband Ayman spent 3 years renovating it for their 8 children.
وانتقلنا جديد لسه قبل 4 شهور. بيت واسع، حياة، قبال البحر، نطلع نتسوق، أولادي يروحوا على مدارسهم.
ذكريات حياة، نمط حياة، أسلوب حياة هنا، الروتين. نصحى والدي يطلع على السوق يتسوق وبعدين يرجع بالصبح نعمل فطور ناكل بعدين يطلع على الشغل تاعه. أبوي كان يحضر لنا العشاء مع الوالدة. كان في الحمص يطحن ويعملنا فلافل بالليل لأنه هو كان يحب الفلافل.
والحمد لله إنه عشنا حياة طبيعية، حياة حلوة، حياة سعيدة. يعني إحنا كنا مثلا لو كنا نحكي دائما على سبيل المثال بده يصير حرب، كنا نحكي تصير تصعيد على أسبوع 10 أيام بالكتير، انطارت مش هتعدي الشهر. والله ما رضينا نطلع من البيت.
When their neighborhood in northern Gaza was bombed, they were forced to flee their home in search of safety. They came to stay with relatives in this building, not far from their home.
وكل تفكيرنا كيف بدنا نكون بخير، كيف أنا بدي أحتضن أولادي، جوزي يكون طيب وبخير، بناتي بخير، أولادي بخير، ما نتعرض للأذى، ما نتعرض للقصف، ما نتعرض لإصابات، نكون بأمان. هذا كل تفكيرنا.
نسبة على النشر الإخبارية على أمل إنه يكون في هدنة وقف إطلاق نار. وإحنا كنا محاصرين طبعاً يعني، وكان القصف عندنا قريب كتير. كان رعب الليل رعب بشكل لا يوصف يعني، حتى وإحنا نايمين ما ننامش مرتاحين. ننام غفوة زي ما بيحكوها، مش إنه نوم كامل كمان يعني، لا سمح الله صار فينا شيء نقدر نعمل يعني.
Their worst fears came true early in the morning of December 11th, when a massive airstrike hit their building. Al Jazeera's cameras captured the aftermath.
يعني استهدف قوات الاحتلال صبيحة هذا اليوم منزل عائلة سالم، منزل يكتظ السكان في حي الشيخ رضوان في مدينة غزة.
Like thousands of other buildings in Gaza, it was completely destroyed and hollowed out. Family homes turned to ash and rubble.
ما لحقوش يصحوا الناس، ما سمعنا الا صوت الانفجار، دب هزز المنطقة، تهزز زي ما انت شايف كيف كله سلاح.
Heba, her husband and children were injured but survived. However, according to witnesses, more than 100 people were killed.
وكتير فقدنا من العائلة، وأولاد عم جوزي بنت عمته، كتير فقدنا من العائلة. اتصابنا بناتي تنتين صبايا تصابوا إصابات خطيرة على أساس إنهم أصلاً لما طلعوا شهداء، وابني تصاب بطل يشوف بعيونه، وإحنا تصابنا كلنا بوجع في ألم، ما عرفنا وين أصلاً بدنا نروح بحالنا أو لمين نلجأ، مين اللي بده يسعفنا ومين اللي بده ياخدنا.
أخوتي مصابين أقدر ألاقي مكان يقويهم كمان، لأنه في من أخوتي ما بيقدروا يتحركوا يعني، البيت كان غير صالح للسكن.
ما في مكان محدد يعني إنه حيكون بخير، يعني كل مكان إحنا بنروح فيه متعرضين فيه للخطر، متعرضين فيه للخوف، متعرضين فيه لضرب المدفعيات، متعرضين فيه للقصف.
"102 names we found were killed in one moment, effectively. But there were also allegations that it might have been 200 people who were killed. This is something we've seen multiple times in Gaza because people are trapped under rubble for a really long time."
Air Wars, which monitors civilian harm, has been documenting airstrikes in Gaza. We asked them to examine the December 11th attack.
And what happened in this strike was you had an attack on several different buildings. So when you go through our kind of investigation, you'll see that we split out all of the members of the family by which home they were in order to understand really the scale of devastation.
هنا ينتشل أهالي الشهداء وهم أشلاء مقطعة.
Do you know how many children were killed in the attack?
So we estimated 50 at least.
And how common was this type of attack that you investigated on December 11th?
I would say this is one of so many.
وأمي وأخويا وأختي وأولادي اثنين ماليش غيرهم، وأولادي اثنين كمان راحوا. أنا أولادي ابني ومرتي وبنتي وبنتي. هذا طفل لا يبلغ عمره أيام، مولود في الحرب. هذا الطفل إيش سوى؟
We have documented time and time again almost 100 people being killed in a single strike. This is the conflict where we have counted more children killed in a single strike than we have in any other conflict, multiple times.
كل أحفادي نسوانهم وأولادهم وجزانهم.
نسعى نخبر زي في مجزرة، وين الدول وين العالم تقف معانا تشوف كيف نسوان وبنات وأولاد وكلهم ميتين، وين كنتوا بتتفرجوا علينا؟
When we all look back and when we finished counting, I think we're going to see it as a typical case rather than the exception.
אנחנו במלחמה, לא במבצע, לא בסבבים.
Well, let's see. I'm not sure where the camera is, so I'm just looking straight ahead. Oh, here we go. First of all, I want to apologize for the technical difficulties that we have experienced. I cannot emphasize how powerful and how important this film is. It is available to view, to download from the EPI website, EPICALC, Ecumenical Peace Institute Clergy Laity Concerned.org. And in a few moments, we will be watching an excerpt of a film on international law as it applies to the conflict, the genocide. I do want to ask that those of you who have questions, please put them in the chat. Somebody here will monitor them, and we'll get to them. And we have here off camera our members of our board and other people have supported us and given us generously of their time, and we thank you all for being here. And now the excerpt on international law. Oh.
Welcome, Pastor Max Lynn.
Oh. I'm sorry, I see you so seldom, I don't recognize you. This is Pastor Max Lynn. He is our gracious host who has helped make it possible here. So thank you, Reverend.
Good to be here. Thank you for being here.
Our pleasure. Well, I don't want to say pleasure, but it's good that we're here because this is important, vitally important.
Excuse me, Daniel. I believe Wind is here to talk about the flotilla also.
I thought because
it's on the schedule.
Wind was to speak on it and she spoke, I thought, I couldn't hear to know.
For Salka, couldn't talk.
Oh.
She's on the schedule. You have it next.
Okay, so we're back on schedule.
And then the international law.
Okay, so next we have Wind, is that correct?
Yeah.
Wind Kaufman, who will be speaking on, and I can actually see it here somewhere.
I'm confused. I thought I already.
Here we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, on the flotilla.
Yes, on the flotilla.
Oh, that's right.
As we shift gears here.
Okay, well.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was in Istanbul in April and May waiting to depart for Gaza with 5,000 tons of humanitarian aid. Ultimately, what happened is that Israel sabotaged it by pressuring the flag country to withdraw their flag. So we couldn't sail. We waited to see if things could be ironed out. It was a bureaucratic issue. Nothing was wrong with the boat. It passed all inspections. But ultimately, we were sent home because the bureaucracy was wasn't getting anywhere. So what happened is that the aid did proceed to Gaza and it got stuck in the line at the Rafah crossing and it never made it in because Israel was not letting in much aid at all. We are still trying, the aid organization in Turkey that owns the boat is restocking it and it is ready to go. The thing that's stopping it now is the Turkish government itself is not allowing for passage. All the other bureaucratic issues were alleviated, but the government of Turkey now is standing in the way. And so now there are some major protests by the Turkish citizens and with some international support to pressure the Turkish government to allow it to sail. The motto is when governments fail, we'll sail. And we're still committed to that. And hopefully we will be able to sail at some point and bring in humanitarian aid. But ultimately, it was a political mission to break the blockade of Gaza and bring in the incredibly needed humanitarian aid. So anyway, in the meantime, we can just support by following Boats to Gaza on Instagram, and you can go to the website and yeah, and of course, do everything else that you're, I'm sure, doing for Palestine, writing your senators, participating in demonstrations, talking to people, and so forth. So thank you. Abraham, I think you're on mute.
You're still muted. Mark has the controls.
I don't have any control over
You
that.
just did.
I just
Okay.
Oh, okay, got it.
We can hear now.
Go ahead. Now you can speak.
What did you guys online hear? You're back a little bit.
I didn't hear anything after I stopped speaking.
Yeah, coming up is the excerpt on international law, and our speaker is Huwaida Arafat. Huwaida Araf.
They're not hearing me.
And
Oh, they're now.
coming up.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is generally agreed to be the foundation of international human rights law. It represents the universal understanding that basic rights and fundamental freedoms are inherent to all human beings, inalienable, and equally applicable to everyone, and that each and every one of us is born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, what are the principles of international humanitarian law? I'm going to try to cover these quickly. The first is the principle of distinction. This one says that only combatants and military objects may come under direct attack. Civilians and civilian objects may never come under direct attack unless they lose their protections. They can lose their protections if they start contributing to the military objective. So if a civilian decides to pick up arms and join the fighting, that civilian is going to lose his or her protections. If a civilian object is used for military purposes, it is going to lose its protection for the period that it is used for military purposes. However, if there is ever any doubt, then the default is to consider it civilian and not to attack it. So a party to a conflict cannot just think that a civilian object is being used for military purposes and decide to attack it. There needs to be more concrete information, or the default is that it is protected. In the situations of hospitals specifically, if there are fighters inside that are wounded and being treated, that does not convert the hospital into a military objective, and those fighters specifically are no longer legitimate military targets. If you put down your arms, if you are hors de combat, you are not a legitimate target. The principle of distinction also applies to weapons. If you are using weapons that cannot distinguish between civilian and military objects, these weapons are unlawful. Any direct attack on even one civilian or a civilian object is not only a violation of IHL, it is a grave breach. These are categorized as war crimes. And this principle of distinction is customary international law, so it is universally binding on all states. Next is the principle of proportionality, which recognizes that harm to civilians cannot always be avoided. This is where we often hear the term collateral damage. This principle says that where harm to civilians cannot be avoided, the harm to civilians needs to be proportional to the military advantage. The principle prohibits attacks where the harm to civilians is going to be excessive in relation to the military advantage sought. So, for example, a party to a conflict cannot decide to drop a 1-ton bomb on a crowded civilian neighborhood to target one military commander. This principle also cannot be used to override other principles of IHL. Therefore, with direct attack on civilians, there is no proportionality assessment there because direct attacks on civilians is prohibited. So a direct attack on even one civilian is already a violation of IHL. There is no proportionality assessment. Closely tied to the principle of proportionality is the notion of necessity. Military necessity acknowledges that under the laws of armed conflict, winning a war or a battle is a legitimate military objective, and it allows armed forces to engage in conduct even where that conduct is going to cause harm and destruction. But it does not give armed forces carte blanche to engage in whatever conduct it wants. It does mandate that other principles of IHL are respected and actually calls on parties to an armed conflict to use the least amount of force required in order to achieve their military objectives. There is a prohibition on the infliction of unnecessary suffering, and there is an ongoing responsibility on all parties to a conflict to take precaution to protect as much as possible civilians and civilian objects. In this context, we hear about warnings given to civilians to leave a certain area or to abandon a building that is going to be targeted. These warnings are part of the obligations of parties to an armed conflict, but these obligations are not met simply by issuing the warning. The obligation is not met, and the warnings really are meaningless if they cannot be safely heeded. You cannot say you met your obligation of warning civilians if you're telling them to flee a certain area, but there is no way that they can safely flee, or the only other place they can go is also dangerous. Then those obligations are not met, and the subsequent military conduct can be considered a war crime.
You're muted. Mark, can you unmute? We can't hear the room on Zoom.
Still muted.
Study it because it's important information.
I'm so sorry, I muted the wrong one, so you're gonna start.
Did anything I say?
No.
Oh, okay. I'll make it quick. Book, important, $50.
Take your time.
Okay. The first 14 individuals to donate $50 or more will receive a copy of the hardcover. And as I said a little earlier, what was covered on international law.
Just quickly on the book, can they also go to our website and get the link to buy the paperback?
Okay. Yeah. Put it down?
No, he's asking us if the paperback is on the webpage.
You can go to our website.
It will be on the website. You will be able to order the paperback from the website. I believe Abe Books is a vendor, but I will make that clear. Again, I cannot emphasize how important it is that we understand international law as it applies to the ongoing genocide. It is just horrific and inexcusable. So please follow and study that. Are we ready for Mr. Solomon? Or is something else in the queue?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, great. You can hear me. Well, that's wonderful. I'm so glad to participate in this event. And I have remembered when there's mention of CALC, Clergy and Laity Concerned, 50 years ago, I would go to events and demonstrations called by clergy and laity concerned. It's just to remind ourselves that we are part of a very long tradition, and we are countering a terrible tradition of militarism from the US government, which of course continues. Right now, we're acutely aware that the next several years will be not only a continuation of US foreign policy, but likely even worse. And I think it's useful, while we're aware that domestic and foreign policies are intertwined, to make some distinctions between the changes that we can expect domestically and in terms of US foreign policy. It's pretty clear that starting on January 20th, our politics within the United States will drastically shift. And in matters of civil liberties, racial justice, voting rights, immigration, and public pronouncements from powerful officials, the conduct of the executive and legislative branches, and more, there are going to be some terrible changes that will be implemented. In terms of foreign policy, if we leave aside the crucial matter of climate, for instance, for the most part, I don't believe that we will see a drastic change for the worse, which is not a positive statement to make, because we've had a continuity of what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism this year, last year, the year before, and stretching back decades. The reality is that with the Pentagon budget reaching close to $1 trillion with a T dollars a year, that the United States has continued to be on a highly militaristic trajectory. I'm really glad that EPI has brought us here today to gather, to share information, and hopefully rededicating ourselves. A couple of years ago, I thought that I should try to write a sequel to my book, War Made Easy, which chronicled especially the 1980s and 90s, the first years of the so-called War on Terror, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And it struck me as we lived through the Obama era and then the beginning of the presidency of Donald Trump, that there had been a gradual shift, not in the reality of US foreign policies and US reliance on a tremendous military force, but in the style, in the way in which the militarism has been continuing. And so if we look at what was going on in 2003 and through the rest of that decade and into the Obama presidency, we had hundreds of thousands of US soldiers on the ground, the expression boots on the ground, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, the bombing of Libya. For the most part, that was on the ground combat and operations combined with massive US air power. However, for some political and geopolitical reasons, there has been a gradual shift, and I tried to describe and chronicle that shift in War Made Invisible, which came out a little bit over a year ago in hardcover, because it became less viable politically and militarily for the United States to continue to have large numbers of troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. And while there had been tremendous reliance on air power throughout, more and more, not only relying on the drones and the bombers and so forth, but to increase the proportion of the US military actions from the air, seemingly above it all. And so a few years ago, President Biden went to the United Nations and he made a speech right after the US had withdrawn its last troops from Afghanistan. And he said, "We've turned the page. The United States is no longer at war." That was a complete lie. The Cost of War project at Brown University had documented that as Biden spoke at the United Nations, the United States was involved in military activity in about 85 countries, training troops, engaged in secret operations, all sorts of military endeavors, maneuvers under the heading of counterinsurgency and the so-called war on terror and so forth. And so we had an increasing invisibility of the US wars, even as they continued in different forms. I wrote and I contend that the US wars have always been largely invisible because the realities of war are virtually unseen and not understood by the US public. For one thing, the media coverage dramatically downplays the human suffering as a result. And also, there are inherent limitations to what the technology of news operations can really convey. I mean, remember the cliche, television brings war into your living room. Well, that's nonsense. What is watching a TV have in common with being in a war zone? It's a sort of a conceit that we were encouraged to believe. And to the extent we believed it, then we were further estranged from the reality of what war is all about. The biases of war, as I document in the book, the biases of media coverage have been continual. And so when the United States invaded Iraq, we had a lot of coverage about the suffering of US soldiers and their loved ones, relatively little empathetic coverage about the suffering of people on the other end of Pentagon firepower. And as time has gone on, the contrasts in this century have been very extreme. We have seen very empathetic coverage within the limitations of the technology and journalism, empathetic coverage for more than 2 years now, almost 3 years now, of the horrible Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that coverage is, if you leave aside the political bias, the failure to acknowledge the role of NATO and so forth, if you look at the actual coverage of the suffering of civilians and others in the Ukraine war, that shows that US corporate media are capable of conveying something very deep about the suffering that occurs in war when the invasion is implemented and the war is waged by a designated enemy of the White House. And so when Russians bomb a hospital, we get excruciating coverage. When Israel bombs a hospital, as it has done repeatedly and methodically in Gaza, then it's tamped down in terms of how vivid the coverage is, how empathetic it is, and how protracted it is. And so the same kind of contrast between coverage of the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Ukraine has also played out in terms of the last 13 months. As I began to work on an afterword to the War Made Invisible book, because I knew a paperback version would be published this fall in 2024, I really tried to write about what I thought would be of enduring importance. I hoped last spring and summer, I hoped I would be writing about the history of a war that had happened. I hoped to be writing about a war that had started on October 7th and had ended by the time this paperback came out in September, just a couple of months ago. As we know, this war has continued. It's protracted. It only is possible because of the United States. And I tried to mull over and write about in a way that conveys realities of the society we live in, the politics, the political economy, the governmental structures, the media, conveys what has made and continues to make possible the US role in directly making feasible mass murder and genocide inflicted on human beings, civilians, throughout Gaza. And now, of course, the ongoing war, again, made literally possible by U.S. military assistance in Lebanon as well. It's really not consistent with what we were brought up to believe about the United States. It's not consistent with what we are routinely encouraged to believe about the United States from U.S. mass media and politics and programs like All Things Considered and Morning Edition and PBS NewsHour, which are corporate media outlets, if not explicitly so. And the role of the United States government and society in continuing to make possible genocide is one that's a complete disconnect with the self-concept that we've been encouraged to have. And I think that says a lot, or should say a lot, to us about our own roles. I think it was Margaret Mead who said, don't ever doubt that 10 people can change the future if they organize. And certainly that's the case. There's more than 10 of us gathered here today. We know that we are in a tradition, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, of challenging the warfare state, of challenging that madness of militarism. And it's always a very uphill battle. I think if we look where we are now and take stock of the last year and the last years, something that I would contend is that the history ever since 9/11 has been an increase of a dynamic that made possible in most of our lifetimes the Vietnam War, the invasion of Grenada and Panama, attacks on Libya, on Afghanistan, on Iraq, and on, making possible because the structure and mentality of the society, the political economy is so geared into essentially perpetual warfare. You may remember that the day after October 7th last year, the Israeli ambassador to the United States and the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations both used the same phrase within hours of each other. They told the news media, "This is our 9/11." And on the surface, that would seem to be a very reasonable statement and one that would not cause particular alarm in terms of response. But as I write about in War Made Invisible, in point of fact, that is and was a very ominous statement because the terroristic attack on 9/11 that killed 3,000 people was followed by a so-called war on terror led by the United States that has resulted in not only what Dr. King called the demonic destructive suction tube of taking billions of dollars away from life-sustaining programs in the United States, but this so-called war on terror has resulted in, according to the Brown University Cost of War Project, in about 450,000 direct civilian deaths, close to 1 million direct deaths. And if you include the indirect deaths of this purported war on terror, which in fact has been a war of terror, the total deaths, according to the Cost of War Project, in the last 23 years have added up to about 4.5 million people. So you have 3,000 souls that were exterminated on 9/11, and then you have several million souls exterminated in the following 2 decades plus, with the rationale that it's a humane response, a responsible response to 9/11. The parallel is very much there in terms of Israel's war on Gaza. As Benjamin Netanyahu and other top Israeli government officials have said, just as Donald Rumsfeld said almost a quarter of a century ago, it's not our fault. Rumsfeld said at the end of 2001 that all the deaths in Afghanistan, including civilians, were the fault of al-Qaeda. And Israeli officials have said that all the deaths, including civilians in Gaza, are the responsibility of Hamas. So this is what I call in the book the blank check for ongoing mass murder. It's a license that a government issues for itself, to itself. It's a license to kill with no expiration date. I'd like to close by saying a bit about our own political work, which I think is very important, of course, crucial at many different levels for social justice and to try to stop the runaway warfare state. And all the work that we've done, all the liaison, the protests, the letter writing, all of that, absolutely crucial. I think we should as well take a realistic look at the ultimate threat of ultimate violence, which is nuclear war. And the greatest threat, of course, there is between the two nuclear superpowers. And when we as constituents, as activists, relate to our representatives in Congress, I fear that when we are represented by some of the best, we are overly deferential. And let me give you an example. When then President Trump met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, the reaction from the heroic Congresswoman Barbara Lee was that that was a terrible thing, that the President of the United States had no business meeting with President Putin. We were told that the biggest threat to democracy in the United States was the Russian government, that Russiagate. We heard about the oligarchs in Russia. We didn't hear much about the oligarchs in the United States. And we heard that somehow what was called the spirit of Glassboro in 1967, when Lyndon Johnson met with Alexei Kosygin, that somehow efforts for détente would be scurrilous, would be distasteful, would be wrong. Most Democrats in Congress are saying that. Most Democrats in Congress are voting to ship tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine, condemning diplomacy. You may remember that the Progressive Caucus in the US Congress drafted and sent a letter to President Biden a couple of years ago, just before the midterm elections. And the letter said, we need diplomacy with Russia over Ukraine. And it was signed by about 30 members of Congress. And when the letter was made public, many Democrats in Congress went ballistic. They said, we cannot call for diplomacy with Russia. That is no solution for the Ukraine war. And so within a couple of days, that letter was renounced and officially withdrawn by the progressive members of Congress who had sent it in the first place. So overall, even those Congress members who we have been glad to praise for the good things they have done, for the most part, they have themselves, to a significant degree, accommodated themselves to the warfare state. And yet we are so grateful for the good things they do that we're very hesitant to confront them. We're very hesitant to use the nonviolent tools in the toolbox to have meetings, to send letters, to get out the picket signs, to challenge nonviolently and emphatically these members of Congress who are among the most progressive, who are still part of the war machine. And I think this is a tremendous challenge going forward because, and I'll close here, that as we have this monstrous new administration coming in, there will be a tendency for many Democrats in Congress to try to posture as people who are not weak against Russia, not weak against China, and may well work on portraying the new president as some kind of flunky for Russia who should not even talk to the Russian president. those of us, I know it's all of us who are gathered here, who are committed to peace and social justice, we really have a challenge to be, as Dr. King said, a drum major for peace, and to get beyond the partisan cues that tell us who we should join forces with unequivocally and not. We should praise and support everything that is laudatory, that we should laud from our representatives when they are part of a peace and justice effort. When they are not, we've got to challenge them because we are their constituents.
Thank you very much. I didn't have a chance to introduce you properly. You've been a tremendous friend to EPI as well as the community at large, and we're grateful for that. Folks, Norman Solomon, I wish you were the norm. If you were the norm, the world would be so much better off. He is an American journalist, media critic, activist, former U.S. congressional candidate, longtime associate of the media watch group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. In 1997, he founded the Institute for Public Accuracy, which works to provide alternative sources for journalists and serves as its executive director. Thank you, Norman. And now we will have a Q&A facilitated by our Nancy Taylor.
So, Mark, my Zoom went out. It says the host will admit you.
Oh. Greg, could you admit her?
Yes,
hear you just fine.
just be careful of the feedback.
Okay.
Oh, you turn your audio off. Remember the button on the top, up here in the corner.
So, can I be heard though?
And again, you may submit questions via our chat.
She's got it.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
So, those of you that are on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat. Those that are here, if you'd like to speak directly to Norman with a question, feel free to do that. Or if you have a written question that you'd like to hand me, either way is fine. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
I think if some people are in the Zoom may not be able to do the chat like Tony and Carolyn, so you might make an exception for if they need it. I'm just saying. Somebody in the Zoom might want to speak and rather than
right,
chat.
but let's start with here.
Yeah. So would you like to?
Candy, so should I come up to the?
Yes.
Just come up and stand right here. Right there.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, we have a change in our own leadership coming up in January. We have indications that Mr. Trump has said that Netanyahu can do whatever he wants and he will basically support that. And I would like to hear your comments about strategies and tactics we may be able to use to combat that kind of, completely open-ended support that has been proposed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's such a key question. And we have experienced in the last 13 months that everything that peace activists and others, those of conscience, those concerned, everything that we have tried has been of very minimal effect. And while I think that the Biden administration has been a tacit accomplice to the genocide, and more than really a tacit accomplice to the genocide in Gaza, as you note, if anything, the new administration literally promises to be even worse. Statements like, do what you have to do and finish the job. And so I think we have a tremendous challenge to deal with the opportunity that every member of the House and Senate has district offices, has places, often if we live in an urban area, pretty close to us where we live. And so to change the political climate that has made it possible for Biden to do and not do what he has chosen to do and not do, and that would give Trump even a sense of a freer hand, to change that, I think one of the best levers we have to pull is from the grassroots, not only grassroots organizing and letters to the editor and so forth like that and petitions, but also to go to, sometimes literally, the offices of our representatives and our senators. And, it's potentially a hopefully very fast Gandhian process. You express your concern to people in power, you convey it, you ask for meetings, you monitor the response, you convey the urgency of the matter, and then there are all sorts of opportunities. I'm really struck by the rarity of how often people get out the picket signs and start picketing the congressional offices near where they live. The flyers and the newspapers, TV, radio, the coverage is often woefully inadequate, but quite possible that would be covered. And I try to imagine what is possible if that were to happen in dozens and dozens or even hundreds of congressional districts around the country. It's not a cure-all. It doesn't solve the problem per se, but I think that would be very, very helpful. One thing I do want to add, you're reminding me, is that I work as part of rootsaction.org, and we have a capacity that people can go ahead and do their own petitions, and then you can message everybody who signs it. It's called DIY Roots Action. And if you haven't already signed up to get our action alerts, while I hope you will definitely donate to and support EPI, in terms of being part of this national network for taking action online and offline, you can go to rootsaction.org. It'll take you about 1 minute. At the top of the homepage, just put in your zip code and your email address. And one of the things we want to be doing is coordinating those kind of picket line actions.
Thank you. Are there any others in the room that would like to speak directly to Norman Solomon? Yeah, come on up.
See you, please.
I would just like to ask a very simple question, and that is, given what Netanyahu has done with Joe Biden and with the escalation with Gaza and Lebanon and dealing with Iran, am I totally crazy in thinking that the Netanyahu government could, one, if feeling cornered or just with what they're doing, either threaten or actually set off nuclear weapons?
I don't think that's a crazy idea at all. Dan Ellsberg, who I'm sure spoke to EPI, I would guess at one time or another, who we love so much and we miss Dan so much, he wrote 50 years ago about how nuclear weapons are used the way that a gun is used by a bank robber who goes into a bank and leaves with the money without ever firing the gun. And so these nuclear weapons, as Dan documented, have been used dozens of times by the head of nuclear armed governments to get their way. And in the case of Israel, they have at the top of the government shown that they have no restraint that would be exercised because of world opinion per se. So that is a very real danger. And of course, it underscores some of the Orwellian aspects of the situation about the concern for Iran getting nuclear weapons. It's very rare, if we step back and think, how many articles and news reports have we read and seen and heard in the last year about Israel and its military actions? How often have they mentioned even that Israel has nuclear weapons? It is the official policy of the US government not to acknowledge that it's a nuclear armed state. And so I think your concern is very justified. One aspect that needs a lot of attention, it was thrown off track because of what happened on October 7th and the war on Gaza. But the so-called Abraham Accords were a step towards so-called normalizing relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And one of the carrots that was being held out to Saudi Arabia was to give it nuclear technology, which of course is very ominous. And I mean, I'm no theologian, but it's ironic that it would be called the Abraham Accords. There's Abraham went to Isaac, right? You may know the song by Leonard Cohen, The Song of Isaac. I mean, what is this idea that you get this message in your head to kill your child or somebody else's child and you do it? This is the mentality that is in control in Washington and in the Israeli government itself.
Oh, Meg.
Thanks so much for your book, and I am going to be getting it. George just posed a question I'll follow up with. I just finished the book Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobson. I just wondered if you'd ever collaborated with her on parts of her book. And my second question is just the generals who retire from the armed services, they seem to come years later and share their regrets. Do you have any comments about them and their influence on current generals and the defense secretary?
Yeah, thank you for both of those questions. I'll take the second one first. I think it's a good observation. I mean, some are unrepentant, but some it's the opposite. I mean, you think of, although it was not a complete repentance, so to speak, but Robert McNamara towards the end, many, including, well, even Henry Kissinger, you know, expressing concern about the momentum towards nuclear war. And this is, it's a phenomenon. I don't, you know, sometimes it's more a question of psychoanalysis than political analysis, why someone serves those military functions and then towards the very end of their lives will really change. I think better late than never, and their voices are sometimes very, very helpful in public. I think of former Defense Secretary, uppercase D, Defense Secretary William Perry, who has been very eloquent about the need to shut down all ICBMs. He knows the dynamics. ICBMs are the very worst hair trigger nuclear weapons, most dangerous for launching a nuclear war. And then in terms of your other question, I have not read that book. I've read about it. I think it was a very positive step when the New York Times in the last year has run a series of articles about the renewed threat of nuclear weapons and, in a sense, renewing some media attention to the threats of nuclear war. I'm sorry to say, I take some of it with a grain of salt. The United States has led the nuclear arms race, including in the last 2 decades. The mass media have not challenged it. There's often a concern about the danger of nuclear war without really focusing on the US role. I mean, Russia also has made irresponsible, dangerous threats towards Ukraine. China is installing more ICBMs, but the US has led the way, has canceled in this century, has pulled out of the ABM Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I think most of us, certainly I am old enough to remember when a great triumph of the peace movement in Europe and the United States in the 1980s was the INF Treaty, where an entire class of medium-range missiles, even during the Reagan administration, were banned. And now under Trump, that was canceled, and then Biden did nothing to restore it. So we have, of course, a tremendous challenge on that front. And one other thing I'll add on this, at rootsaction.org, we've launched something called the Diffuse Nuclear War Campaign. We're at diffusenuclearwar.org. And on election night, the Pentagon, the Air Force, launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base a ICBM dummy test missile to the Marshall Islands. And we had a number of people there. We put out a news release. We're actually there as the votes were being counted, doing civil disobedience against the launch. So we're, let me just close on this one other point. A very famous leader of the climate movement was saying a few years ago that the threat of nuclear war had been solved, and now we had to do something similar with the threat of climate change. And obviously that's completely wrong, and especially ironic because we now know that nuclear war would cause nuclear winter, which is a drastic immediate form of climate change to wipe out agricultural capacity within a matter of months after the nuclear war. So we have this real challenge to confront climate change and the nuclear arsenals as well.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple of questions here. Have there been delegations from the U.S. faith communities which have traveled to Gaza to demonstrate support for the people of Palestine?
I'm aware of
Will
some.
there be more
Yeah,
of these?
definitely. And many efforts. I think we heard a little while ago this afternoon about one effort to bring in, was it 5,000 tons of supplies, food, and so forth turned away. And Ann Wright, and speaking of retired officials, Ann Wright, the former colonel in the Army, a wonderful peace activist, was on a ship that was trying to go, I believe it was another ship from, or was based in Turkey anyway, and again, foiled. So a lot of people from faith communities and others have really tried to do that with very, very little success. And one of the things that's happened in the focus on this election in recent weeks is very little focus on the deteriorating from a horrific situation to begin with in terms of the blockage of food. I mean, this is, as we know, the UN has been clear. A lot of the documentation in War Made Invisible is from the UN in the last year, has pointed out Israel uses the capacity it has to block food as a weapon of war. They're using starvation as a weapon of war. The United States government, despite the rhetoric, has been an accomplice because that could be stopped with a cutoff of military supplies. And so we have these basically war criminals running the Israeli government and really the U.S. government as well. One other thing I'll add, which I write about in the afterword to War Made Invisible in the paperback, that you may remember that one of the most outspoken senators, to his credit, Chris Van Hollen from Maryland, went to the crossings on Gaza, Israel, Egypt early this year, I think it was February, and he came back and he made a floor speech in the Senate, and he said, I saw the Israelis preventing desperately needed food from getting to starving people in Gaza. He said, that is a war crime. The Israeli government is run by war criminals. And a few hours later, Senator Van Hollen voted in favor of shipping $14 billion worth more of weapons to Israel. So this is what we're dealing with in terms of members of Congress.
Along that line, there was a question about the outlet Democracy Now!, a comment that we get, good information, non-biased information about the wars and things. Are you aware of any other outlets that give this kind of information?
Yes, that's really also a great question. Democracy Now!'s work has been terrific, day in and day out, covering the war on Gaza for 13 months now, Lebanon as well. I mean, if you had, we have a news establishment, as I note in the book, that gives Pulitzer Prizes to people like Thomas Friedman, who cheer on the U.S. war machine. Democracy Now! Would be getting Pulitzer Prizes if we had a very different kind of media establishment, because the work has been so terrific. I think The Intercept continues to be really doing great work online. We at Roots Action, I should mention, have launched in the last couple of years something called Progressive Hub. It's at progressivehub.net. And part of Progressive Hub now is something called the 0 Hour. And so if you go to progressivehub.net, you'll see in the top right a graphic you can click on. And the 0 Hour also is doing great coverage. It's hosted by Sonali Kolhatkar and mainly by Richard Oskow, who was the main speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. I think these are really important outlets to support.
Thank you. And then one last question that I have here. There are 500-pound bombs, which it is said can be sent to targets. Then there are 2,000-pound bombs, which can take out neighborhoods. We in the U.S. send both, lots of them. Would it help to differentiate between these in protests?
Well, I think the 2,000-pound bombs, the 1-ton bombs, should be focused on, should be highlighted. At the same time, we have a history in the last 13 months where President Biden at one point withheld some of the 2,000-pound bombs, and then some of the Israel Right or Wrong forces, including Chaim Saban, a multi-million-dollar donor to the Democratic Party, went ballistic and said, you can't do that. You can't withhold those 2,000-pound bombs. The U.S. government has continued to allow and enable this kind of thing. So I think differentiating, it's the degree of the criminality. And I think the 2,000-pound bombs just epitomize, they symbolize as well as literally are expressions of just how vicious, cruel, and depraved the U.S.-Israeli alliance is. I should mention in the previous question, among those outlets I think are just terrific are commondreams.org. And it's daily. And just if you go to your computer device, whatever it may be, every day the news and commentary at commondreams.org is just really providing a major service for news flow and information and analysis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. At this time, I would like to call those of you that are online attention to the QR code that's on one of the screens. I'm not sure if it's really working well. It might be, and if it is, you can just use that to go directly to the donate section of the EPI website. If it's not working, just go to the donate section of the EPI website directly. As Daniel said earlier, these donations, this is our fundraising event, and these donations are so important. We rely on this event to provide the revenue that we need pretty much for the year. So dig deep, and with that.
Nancy, did you get the ones from the chat? Did people have questions?
There are a few.
Okay, okay, let me see here. Thank you.
By the way, I just checked, and for some reason or other, the link isn't working, but I will fix that. So sometime in the next 10 or 15 minutes, the donate link on the EPI website will function. Promise.
Okay. Here's one. The 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will take place in 9 months. What efforts are being made to use that anniversary to highlight the present day dangers of nuclear war?
Given that the news media will perhaps pay special attention because there's a 0 at the end of the anniversary, it is an opportunity. I know groups are already talking about it. Imagine that some of us gathered today go to Livermore on those anniversaries. I was glad to be out there last August 6th. And it is an opportunity at the same time that, for instance, we had the Oppenheimer film. I would just sort of digress to that. And on the one hand, it was a very good chance to talk about, to convey. It was such a big box office hit, as the saying goes. So that was a step forward because people were encouraged to forget about the threat of nuclear war, forget about what the Manhattan Project was and what it did and the results at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people who were in those two cities were basically invisible in the film. And as we look ahead to the 80th anniversary, I think we have that challenge to get away from the focus on people like J. Robert Oppenheimer and talk about and convey what nuclear war really would portend for humanity.
Thank you. Here's a question. Do you think it is worthwhile to try to organize around the fact that we should recognize that Israel has organized an apartheid state, especially, specifically in the whole country and Palestine? Would it be worthwhile to notify companies to stop buying goods made in Israel because of the way their society is organized with apartheid? Thanks.
Absolutely. I think so. B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they all have issued reports calling Israel an apartheid state. Ben and Jerry's, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield took enormous steps. It took a lot of work to get their ice cream out of the occupied territories. And there's a lot of potential to raise this. I think the challenge, and I speak as a Jewish person, the challenge is that whenever we point out the criminality, the viciousness, the cruelty of the Israeli government, we're accused of being anti-Semitic. It's absurd. And this isn't just a faraway thing. The BDS efforts, which would withhold support for the Israeli commerce and so forth, boycott and this divestment, sanctions. What was done with apartheid South Africa? That was boycotts. These were sanctions. That's what we fought for. So we had apartheid South Africa. We nonviolently challenged that regime. Now BDS is an effort to nonviolently challenge the Israeli apartheid regime. What is the response? We have many members of the California legislature pushing through measures, and one of them has been signed by Newsom, I think, to try to tamp down on criticism of Israel and to equate it with anti-Semitism. My congressperson here in the North Bay is not unique. Congressman Jared Huffman, a liberal progressive, self-described, he says point blank in public, BDS is anti-Semitic. This is the kind of Orwellian messaging that we're up against. So it's a kind of long-winded answer of saying, yes, I think focusing on injustice in Israel and the apartheid reality is really important.
Thank you. Question on international law. How clearly is a distinction made between violence used in physical defense of persons and violence used to gain or preserve economic advantage?
I think we heard a very good description a little while ago this afternoon, talking about international law. I think, as I understand it, I'm no lawyer, but as I understand it, there are clear distinctions. And anybody, and Margie Cohen, former president of the National Lawyers Guild, and many others have pointed out there's no way what Israel is doing in Gaza has anything to do with defense. The standard line that has come from the Republicans and Democrats leading in the House and Senate, coming from Biden, coming from Trump, is Israel has a right to defend itself, quote unquote. What Israel's doing has nothing to do with that.
Yeah. Please speak more about U.S. policy in Haiti.
Well, I'm definitely not an expert on Haiti. We know that going back to the support of Papa Doc, Baby Doc Duvalier, the United States has a history of aligning with brutal dictatorships in that country, economic exploitation. And Pierre is on your board, I think, and he's really an expert. It's unfortunately a situation where the U.S. defines the Monroe Doctrine as we run the show. I mean, I'm into supplying the food and the medicine, and the alliance with dictatorships, as in Haiti and elsewhere, has just been horrific for the people of the country.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yes, please step forward.
Okay. Hi, Norman. So in terms of at the Bioneers Conference a little while ago in Berkeley, there was an Israeli there and talked about recent polling being as low as 15% for Netanyahu. And then you have Schumer, a big recipient of AIPAC money, coming out and asking him to step down in essence. How is it that the Israeli government, under Netanyahu, is hanging on with such low polling numbers? And then another kind of second comment question is, I noticed that Democracy Now! Got dropped from KQED with no explanation. It normally was on at 9 o'clock and at 9-3, that channel.
Yeah.
Suddenly it disappeared, and then you search the web for why, and it's gone. Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I was pleasantly surprised that I guess it's a secondary carrier of KQED was airing it for a while, but I don't know about it being dropped. I'm sorry to say it doesn't surprise me. If you look at, and it might interest you if you have time to look on the website of KQED Radio, and month after month, after the beginning of the war on Gaza, the forum program, which is on from 9 to 11, so we're talking 10 hours a week, they just didn't have anything about it. And I think it tells us a lot about the fear in the society, even in this, quote, liberal progressive Bay Area, where it's a third rail, it's a hot potato, not wanting to make people angry by even addressing this ongoing murderous war. About the polling, my guess, I can't remember when the Bioneers were last doing their annual event. My guess is that the 15% was not in the last few weeks, because killing the leader of Hezbollah apparently has really spiked upward Netanyahu's popularity rating. But more to the point of your question, he's had a hammerlock because of the alliance he has with the extreme far right. I mean, he's pretty extreme himself, of course, but he has cobbled together this coalition. And the coalition is such that the one key component will quit and pull the rug out from under his coalition if he doesn't stop bombing in Gaza. And of course, he doesn't want to face his bribery charges. And as long as the war goes on, those charges are in abeyance. So he has quite a motive there to keep the war going. The Knesset theoretically could pull the rug out from under Netanyahu, but that goes to what war does. It traumatizes people, and then it's a great excuse for these mass murdering top officials to say the war should go on and to convince the public that it should let them continue to stay in power.
Nancy, I just want to add my question on to the last one. I'm
Step on up here, please.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What we're looking at is the genocide of the Palestinian people. And I just want to know more about what global outcry is there. This is a genocide. And it bewilders me that we aren't hearing more. I can understand that it's suppressed in the US, but what about in other countries?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tremendous, there's global tremendous attention. However, so many countries are run by interests that have their own interests. For instance, I learned recently there's a tremendous arms trade between the Israeli and Indian government. And in fact, there's a lot of affinity and shared views, which is ironic because the BJP, the Modi government, a lot of the BJP people, they're Hindu nationalists. They don't like Jews. They really dislike Jews. But they have a great alliance with Israel, technology, intelligence, digital services for occupation in Kashmir as well as in Gaza. They're sharing information on how you inflict subjugation on people of another ethnicity. And so, as in Kashmir for India, so they're getting along very well. Many other countries, even like Saudi Arabia, a lot of the countries in the Middle East, sure, they give lip service, but for decade after decade, Palestinians have been basically sold down the river by Jordan, by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia. These are dictatorships. Those are all countries I just mentioned. They torture, including Israel. But all four of those countries, they torture dissidents. They're not effective democracies. And so you have a split, I think, on the planet where most people paying attention are aghast, upset, horrified by what Israel is doing in Gaza. But whether it's Joe Biden or Vladimir Putin or Modi in India, they have other fish to fry. It's a very low priority for them.
Thank you.
There's one other question at the top of the chat. It came very early about the film.
Okay, I couldn't, do you see that?
Sure. The question that was brought about the film, Norman, was what specific ways is the U.S. involved in the sort of conflict that we saw on that video earlier in Gaza?
I think it would be quicker to say how the U.S. is not involved. James Bamford has written for The Nation about the exchange of intelligence and testing out of weapons. There's a complete revolving door between the Pentagon, the U.S. military-industrial complex, and the Israeli government and its military-industrial complex in terms of weapons and how they are functioning in Gaza. The United States is learning a lot about how its weapons are, quote, performing in Gaza and in Lebanon. And at the same time, vice versa, there's a sharing of intel in both directions. So, and of course, the latest stats I've seen, about 80% of the imports of weapons into Israel come from the United States. There's, it's hard to think of a way in which the U.S. is not helping, including diplomatically, or what passes for diplomacy. And at the UN, you may remember the U.S. vetoed in the Security Council 3 different ceasefire resolutions and then abstained and watered it down and then ignored it anyway. So the net effect is that they are shoulder to shoulder, and it's really hard to accept. When I grew up, one of the questions was, how could people in Europe, how could Germans accept the genocide of Jews? And I got a hint during the Vietnam War how a society could continue while people were being slaughtered in Vietnam. We're seeing, I mean, the U.S. society is functioning pretty much without any interruption, disruption, or whatever, while the U.S. makes all this possible in Gaza. And of course, many of the demonstrations have been wonderful. You know, whether it's the Brooklyn Bridge or Grand Central Station or the Golden Gate or the Bay Bridge, many colleges, people are organizing. At the same time, we still have the dominant power structure doing what it's doing.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, I'll just give one last shout out for,
I just have one quick
Oh,
comment.
yes.
So I think that we have a guy that's getting aid into Gaza. So he has been getting aid into Gaza, and I don't know if he's still getting aid into Gaza. We've been giving offerings to a Palestinian pastor who has been getting aid in food inside. So last time I saw the pictures where it was right before Rafah was invaded, and he was feeding children in Rafah. So if we're going to do another offering, I'll let EPI know about it, and I'm going to ask him if he's still able to get in. He somehow seemed to have being a local, had a way to get aid in.
wow, that's great. One last reminder, dig deep for EPI's annual fundraiser. And then with that, Daniel, are we ready to go to the third film excerpt?
Well, we have we have scheduled another excerpt from the film, so do you have that queued up? And that should be on in a moment.
Hind Rajab's case, a 6-year-old child pleading for her life, shocked the world. When the State Department was asked about it, a spokesperson deferred to the Israeli military.
We have asked the Israeli authorities to investigate this incident on an urgent basis. We understand that they are doing so. We expect to see those results on a timely fashion, and they should include accountability measures as appropriate.
I want to ask you about the case of Hind Rajab. Shouldn't the U.S. itself be conducting its own investigations instead of just relying on Israel to investigate itself?
This is one of many very, very troubling reports that needs to be investigated in an objective way. And I do not think that the United States should rely solely on the information that's provided to the U.S. government by the Netanyahu government regarding these allegations, whether it be in this particular case or many other cases.
Under Biden's own arms transfer policy, the administration is supposed to ensure that its weapons are used in accordance with international law. But 3 months in, when more than 22,000 people had been killed in Gaza, White House officials made it clear they weren't looking into possible violations.
Have you taken any action to this day to assess whether Israel is following the rules of war or not?
I am not aware of any kind of formal assessment being done by the United States government to analyze the compliance with international law by our partner Israel.
Why not? And how can you be sure then that the weapons and resources that the U.S. is supplying is under those guidelines?
I would just tell you that we have not seen anything that would convince us that we need to take a different approach in terms of trying to help Israel defend itself.
I think it's hard to overstate the extent to which here in Washington it's easy to throw international law out the window and pretend it doesn't matter. The purpose is simultaneously to maintain this idea that the US and Israel are operating in line with international and US law, And the second is to sort of undercut other calls for probes and accountability, right? To undercut the ICJ case, to undercut a potential Geneva Conventions conference.
Kids in Gaza are now dying from the deliberate withholding of food. In addition to the horror of that news, one other thing is true. That is a war crime. It is a textbook war crime.
As the civilian death toll continued to rise and starvation was spreading, some Democrats in the Senate began to push the White House to take steps to assess if U.S. weapons were being used by Israel in violation of international law.
The Biden administration needs to more effectively use the levers of U.S. influence. We've had this pattern for a long time where the President of the United States makes reasonable demands of the Netanyahu government, that the Netanyahu government then mostly ignores, and that nevertheless the United States sends 2,000-pound bombs.
In addition to Hind's case, there were numerous incidents that raised questions about the United States' continued support. Like this one, when Israeli forces opened fire on Palestinians desperately trying to get food, killing more than 100 people. And here, where footage shows Israeli forces targeting unarmed civilians in Khan Yunis. Despite seeing attacks like this, by April, it was not clear how thoroughly the administration was assessing possible violations of international law.
We continue to look at incidents as they occur. The State Department has a process in place. And to date, as you and I are speaking, they have not found any incidents where the Israelis have violated international humanitarian law.
They know that those weapons are used in the commission of war crimes, including the deliberate targeting of civilians. Amnesty has provided evidence that the US administration has not rejected and has not denied. What are we to conclude from the US position here? That they tolerate the deliberate killings of Palestinian civilians?
It's not just about following international law, though. There's also a key domestic human rights law that hasn't been enforced: the Leahy Law. It prohibits assistance to foreign military units that commit abuses.
For most countries, before we provide the assistance to a unit, we vet that unit for potential human rights violations. In the case of Israel, we provide the assistance first, and then essentially we keep an ear out for potential allegations of gross violations of human rights. To date, that process has never resulted in a unit of the Israeli security forces being sanctioned by the US, despite very credible allegations of gross violations of human rights, including extrajudicial killings, torture, forced disappearances and rape by Israeli security forces.
In April, the administration said they found credible evidence that specific Israeli units committed abuses before October 7th, but that they would not suspend aid because they believed that the Israeli government had taken steps to deal with the violations.
Do you think that lack of enforcement could have an impact on the conduct of Israeli military units if their top arms supplier isn't enforcing accountability mechanisms?
Well, this is why I've said all along that the United States needs to apply its laws uniformly, whether we're dealing with an adversary or whether we're dealing with a friend, because the credibility of U.S. foreign policy requires that we apply our laws on a uniform basis. So, yes, it's very concerning and alarming when we get reports that that is not happening.
We found gross violations of human rights committed by individuals in 5 different units. When it comes to the Leahy Law that you referenced, a critical part of that law is seeing appropriate remediation when...
When I talk to current US officials, they say, why should we be concerned? No one's going to arrest us. There's no accountability. So there is a culture of impunity within Israel that we have encouraged through not enforcing our own laws. And there is a culture of impunity in our own system that we have encouraged by not enforcing our own laws.
Secretary Blinken, a question from Al Jazeera. What is your message to the families of Palestinian civilians who were killed with U.S. weapons in Gaza? Why is your administration not enforcing U.S. and international law to hold Israel accountable?
Jump in. I would like to ask Robert to talk about his article about a year ago about the role of racism and making sure what we look at, what we cover.
We have a group that's coming in after us, so we've got to wrap it up.
Okay, what we do may seem very little, but it is very important that we do it. That's from Gandhi and many other activists also. So from protesting to phone calls to letter writing to signing petitions to going to rootsaction.org, there's plenty of work for all of us to do. Fortunately, here in the Bay Area, we have several active groups, so you don't have to work alone, and that's very important because you're much more effective if you're working with a group. On Monday, Veterans Day, Interfaith for Ceasefire, Interfaith for Human Integrity, Jewish Voice for Peace, Veterans for Peace, Bay Area Resistance, Code Pink, Chavarral for Free Palestine, all invite you to join them at 11 a.m. at Harry Bridges Plaza, across from the Embarcadero, to urge our Senators Padilla and Butler to join Bernie Sanders' joint resolution of disapproval to block the $20 billion worth of weapons to Israel that our president is trying to send. So if you're at all able to, join us at 11 a.m. Veterans Day at the Embarcadero area. On November 16th, Mecca Middle East Children's Alliance will hold their spectacular annual sale of beautiful items from Palestine. They're fundraising for their decades of work in Gaza and the West Bank. So go to meccaforpeace.org for more information on that. On December 8th, Sunday, NorCal Sabeel will host a Tea for Palestine featuring doctors who have worked in Gaza and raising funds for medical relief for the victims of US-funded bombing in Gaza. Save the date, go to norcalsabeel.org for more information. Also, if you didn't get to see the wonderful talks by Reverend Isaac Munther, the Lutheran minister from Bethlehem, when he was here, you can go to NorCal Sabeel to hear him. AROC, that's Arab Resource and Organizing Center, has a calendar of events on their website where you can keep informed about opportunities to take action. Go to araborganizing.org to view this valuable resource. Stay informed. IfAmericansKnew.org is a wonderful organization for information. There is also American Friends Service Committee, Women in Black, Friends of Wadi Fukin. There's a lot in the Bay Area that you can do. Please be sure you do something for your own mental health as well as the next generation.
Vivian, at this point I'd like to mention that November 16 of 1989 was the day that the 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper and her daughter, were slaughtered by us, by our government, agents of our government. So this November 16 will be the 35th anniversary of my birthday.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, that was trained, the murderers were trained at the School of the Americas Watch in Fort Benning, Georgia, and supplied with weapons by our president.
You guys, there's other people waiting to use the room, so Sally's going to give us a blessing to take us out. And move up here, Sally.
A closing prayer.
Right here.
Which,
Sally.
Here, right here.
Here?
Yes.
Please pray with me. Oh, gracious God, we give you thanks for all of those who have gathered here today and for the mission and ministry of the Ecumenical Peace Institute. We pray for continued open hearts and minds that we may persist in discerning your will for our work. May we continue in earnest to hear your call for the peace and justice that is your plan for all of the peoples of the world. Today we offer special prayers on behalf of those living in peril in Gaza. Especially we pray for the families, the men, the women, the children who've lost their lives in the continuing conflict in that part of the world. We pray for the people living in Haiti, also in peril and conflict. We pray for those who live in danger and fear, praying for the protection and the freedom for the world, peoples the world over. Give us continued energy, strength, inspiration, and love to do the work that betters the lives and the circumstances for all of your peoples. And may we be inspired to work together for a world that brings both safety and opportunity to everyone in every region of our globe. May we work with energy, inspiration, hope, and love. And we pray these things in Jesus' name and in your many names. Amen.
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 I'll not curse the darkness. I will light this candle instead. Illuminate the way, oh God, to thee I cry. I survey this darkness, where the broken bodies lay and bled, while armchair patriots cheer and applaud. I ask thee why? With the fire that this flame kindles, we must strengthen our resolve. Not by our words, but by our actions, may our nation in God's eyes be absolved. I see pain and sorrow, smoke that casts a shroud beneath the sun, widows, orphans, plaintive infant cries pierce to the heart. We must look toward the morrow, with a will begin the work that must be done. Join our hands and hearts as we arise to make a new start. With the fire that this flame kindles, we must strengthen our resolve. Not by our words, but by our actions, may our nation in God's eyes be absolved. I can see the dawning of a nation waging peace at length, when poverty and hunger and war lie deep in the past. We are the foundation. In forgiveness must we find our strength. In God's love which doth command, may our lot be cast. With the fire that this flame kindles, we must strengthen our resolve. Not by our words, but by our actions, may our nation in God's eyes be absolved. Not by our words, but by our actions, may our nation in God's eyes be absolved.